Hi, this is Ken Gosnell with CEO Experience. At our CEO conversation today, we are delighted to host an expert on transition and selling of businesses. And in order to do that effectively, they have to know how to build a business that operates not only when the owner is there, but also when the owner isn't. And so today, I'm delighted to welcome the CEO of EGT Advisors, Stu Welsh. Stu, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Ken, for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, obviously the last few months have been very difficult accounting time for businesses as we've tried to navigate and adjust to some of this new normal and even potentially being shut down. I know that you've looked at businesses for many years, including when you started out, even growing up in your own family business.
Mhm.
So can you tell us a little bit about your business background and or your business story?
Sure, absolutely. So, Ken, as you know, I grew up in family business. It's from the beginning. My parents had started the business in the early '60s, and they were electrical contractors. And in the mid '80s, they acquired a business that was a building supply company from my aunt. My uncle passed away, so that's where I kind of cut my teeth. Spent a lot of time as a CFO, COO, setting up systems. But as you know, in a family business, you do everything. So it's sales, it's running the trucks, it's doing the forklifts, it's whatever needs to be done. And throughout that process, I learned a lot about the basics of business, working with people, but I also left the business and then came back later. And I understand the power of having an ability to get out on your own and then come back in on different terms.
Mm,
So we went through, quite an interesting process for a number of years, and then looked to sell the business and thought, as a lot of owners think, that if I can run a business, and certainly how hard could it be to sell it. And we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know who to get, and it didn't turn out to be a great process. And a couple of days before we were supposed to settle on that business, the buyer decided they weren't interested in us because there were a number of other companies they were buying too and rolling up, and they fell through. So we kind of got kicked to the side as well.
mm.
So it wasn't really the best experience. But looking back, it gave me a lot of understanding in stepping into the certified business exit consultant side and getting trained on that was really what I wish we had had back then, because we would have had knowledge and education and resources to be able to do it in a better way.
Absolutely. I'm sad that you had to go through that, but it does remind us of the value of experiences. And, if we can learn, one of the things that I love about being around other wise leaders and CEOs and business owners is because if I can learn a little bit from their experiences, it means that I don't have to go through all those experiences myself. I can garner for their wisdom. It reminds me real quick, I don't tell very many stories on these, but your statement reminded me a little bit about the two guys that met on the street. One had money and one had experiences. And the guy with the experience, he's the one that left with the money, and the guy with the money left with an experience. And
Mhm.
so, when you've been through it once, like you talked about from a family business perspective, and sometimes it's an unfortunate experience, you do learn a lot of lessons from it. Hey,
Usually
real
we
quick.
learn the best in those challenging times.
Hey, real quick before we move on, I do want to get into acquisition and exiting and building the business and having a real growth mindset. But I love there's so many family businesses. And I think sometimes people, when they think about businesses, they always think about big businesses, or even they think about small businesses, but they think all these small businesses are just so, you know, um, maybe more of a national, maybe a franchise or whatever. There is a lot of small businesses in America that are run by families, and it's just the mom and the father, mom and dad, or could be a child that's in the business. And that was your experience. I think they're the heartbeat of America and the American economy. But sometimes family businesses can be tough because you're dealing not only with all the emotions of business, but also all the emotions of family. Can you give us some insight on how did you guys navigate that family business, or how have you helped other family businesses navigate some of those tensions and turmoils that happen just by the nature of it being a family business?
Yeah, great question, Ken. Really, what I kind of found along the way, and I've learned more, it's been really kind of reinforced through other clients I've worked with. You really have to separate the business from the family. I know they're all intertwined, but truthfully, you have to treat the business as sort of a family member. And I always say it's kind of like, that's the baby in the room.
Mm.
because it cannot take care of itself. It needs to be supported. It needs to be fed. It needs to have, kind of the whole things that another family member might need. And very oftentimes it's not looked at from that perspective. And so if you can do that, then part of what you're doing is then it's easier to separate out the person from the position
Mm.
within the business. A lot of times you'll have family members, and I experienced it too, where by age, somebody's going to be in charge. And maybe that is the right person, maybe it's not the right person. I think it's really important to do profiling, through strength finders or disc test or other type of methods to understand where people's strengths are and then determine where they should fit within the organizational chart in the business.
Mm.
If you treat it like a business, it will serve the family.
Boy, that's a powerful statement that you just made too. I love what you said before about the business is the baby in the room, but if you treat it like a business, it will benefit the family. Boy, that's a powerful
Right.
statement, right?
And sometimes, Ken, that means that people need to leave the business. They
Mm.
can still be part of the family, but they might need to leave the business. They might not be the right fit. And I know from my personal experience, leaving and coming back was very different than people who stay in a business and never leave. There's a sense of respect that you gain from the family as well as the staff and team when you've gone out and come back. And even if you're very, very good, it's very oftentimes that you believe it or others believe you're not as good as you could be or should be if you've never left and come back. So I
Mm.
think it's really important to spend some time away and kind of see how things are really being run in other areas. And a lot of the large corporations, the large family corporations, they require that. They will send their family members out to work somewhere else for a period of time before they allow them to come back in.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice. Hey, real quick, one of the questions I get a lot of times, and I think you're a real expert on it, is, and you just mentioned it, when you treat the business like a business, sometimes you have to make some pretty tough business decisions as it relates to family. So, how do you fire a family member?
Well, I think it's important to help them understand. First off, I think the profiling is really good because then they see their strengths
Mm.
and others see their strengths. And I've watched situations and lived through them where if you try to put a creative person into an accounting role, it could turn out pretty bad, but if you take that creative person, put them in a marketing role, then they can maybe thrive. And oftentimes people are just expected to step into the role the parent thinks they should be in, even if it's not the best role for them. And they never really fit and they never really grow. And so it's really important to find out what strength do they have and where would they fit within the organizational chart. Sometimes it is they just don't fit in the organizational chart. And if that's the case, that doesn't mean the owner doesn't have to, they can still have ownership in the family business without being in the business. They don't need to have any control of the business to have ownership. And a lot of times that's not understood. It can be separated. And so let's just say a family had 4 children and 2 of them are working in the business. A lot of times the owner will come to me as I'm walking through a transition plan and they'll go, okay, well, I want to be fair. So I want to give, equal parts to everybody and equal jobs to everybody. And I say, well, that's a recipe for disaster because the ones who really are working hard to make the business work will be demotivated and the others will just be entitled. And either way, it's not positive. And so if we can identify the ones that should be CEO, should be running the business, should be in the operations side based on their strengths and put them there, the others in the family who maybe don't fit in or want to be in another industry can still have ownership and profitability from the business, but they're just not running it and involved in it.
Mm. Yeah, that's good. That's good. We might have to have another CEO conversation just talking about family businesses because there's so many aspects of running a successful family business that is really unique to a family. But I like what you're saying. We talk a lot about, I think one of the aha moments for me and in helping family businesses and even working with family myself is thinking about the biblical business principle of stewardship, right? That I'm not the owner of the business. I'm just a steward. I'm a worker in it as well. And I say stewardship does not allow for entitlement,
Mhm.
right? Because if I'm a steward, it means I can't give a pass on everything. It means that I need to take and use all the resources that I have at my disposal in the most effective way. And so when I teach that, or when we embrace that as a family, then it allows us to say, hey, we need to treat every employee fairly, consistently, recognize that they're part of the family, but from a stewardship perspective. So, hey, that's very helpful. Thanks, Stu. That's great.
Absolutely.
Hey, I know one of the areas that obviously that you learned, that you mentioned in your family business process, was when you went to sell the business.
Mhm.
And many people, again, unless they are living that business life, don't understand that a lot of times families invest all their resources, all the money that they have, in order to keep the business sustainable, believing that when they sell the business, that might be their retirement, or it might be, what they've been investing in all those years. And a lot of times, unfortunately, that doesn't work out. And it sounds like, I don't know the payoff on your end, but as your family went through that, you found that it wasn't as easy to sell, or that process wasn't as easy. And I think that's what led you to open up EGT Advisors, that you really wanted to partner with businesses of all size to really help them through that process of transitioning, continuing on. Can you tell us a little bit about the heartbeat of EGT?
Sure, absolutely. Well, it really was established for that reason, Ken. It's, EGT stands for Exit, Growth, and Transition. And, as you've mentioned before, I have a background as an outsourced CFO. I'd worked with a national firm for close to a decade. And that's how I found out about certification for exit planning. When I came across that, to me, it was like the aha moment of, wow, if we had someone like that back then, we would have been educated with the options. We would have had resources, because all CPAs are not equal, all attorneys are not equal. A lot of times the legacy CPAs and attorneys that business owners are working with are great to get them to a certain point, but they're not great in the transition space. There's just too much to know. And so you just can't know everything about everything. And if you're not doing it all the time, you're not on top of what's going on in the market. So that was the mistake we made. We didn't really understand that. And what I found is now being able to walk in, I've used the analogy before of sitting down with a business owner who says, I want to transition. A lot of times they mean, I want to sell, I want to be out. And so there's more options than just an external sale, but that's where a lot of people just go right to. So if we can look at the other options, whether it's an employee stock ownership plan, if that's appropriate, whether it's an internal transfer to the management team, if that's appropriate. Now, understanding the owner's goals and desires helps guide and eliminate some of the things that don't fit. Because I can talk to many owners who say, I want to just be done and sell. And when we get deeper and we start talking about it, that baby that they've created means something to them. And they don't want to see that legacy go away. And oftentimes, large companies that'll come in, or private equity firms, have a very specific goal, and they will come in and they will change things. The culture will not be the same afterwards. They're about a certain amount of profitability. They have dictates to be able to do for their investors. And so if we can go in to understand the owner's emotional needs, personal needs, that whole mental readiness side is very important, because then they can make a decision and opt out of any areas that don't fit them, and then stay very committed and focused to the exit option that does fit them. And so that's really part of that process. When I saw that and understood how that worked, it really kind of became my mission to be able to go out to business owners and not let them go down the road that my family business did, where they, have the education so they can make the right decisions. And they also understand, that they have the right resources as advisors to be able to get the best accomplishment for their personal goals.
That's awesome. I want to talk about that owner dependence index in just a second, but hey, let's go back to the family business. We did get a question around, is there a better corporate structure for a family business than another that you recommend?
Well, part of the challenge ends up being is where the company has started, because typically when you're working with a family business, or when I have been, they've been around typically for a period of time. They've been around for a while. And so if you're, looking to transition, sometimes you want to see companies that were set up as C Corps in the past might not have the best tax strategy for transition. It takes time to transition them to an S Corp, but there's a lot of changes out there right now in the tax area. I bring in the advisors for those reasons at that time, to understand in that situation what makes the most sense. So it's almost like, and I'm not a wealth manager, I work with those guys, but I've had owners come to wealth managers and just say, invest for me, just take care of it for me. And they're like, well, what do you want? I don't really care, just take care, make sure, I make money.
Mhm.
Well, that's a pretty tough thing because there's lots of options. Do you like risk? Do you not like risk? How soon you need to be out? How much do you need that money? It's the same thing when you look at a business. Oftentimes, we're seeing the stock market kind of stabilize now, but it's been up and down. People are a little nervous. That's going on out there. And many times owners will watch that much more closely than they watch their own business. And yet their business can do a better return than they can ever get from the market. You
Right.
can get a 20, 30, 50% return if you're doing the right things and building the business for value, not just for profitability. So there's a difference in doing that as well. But what I've been seeing though is as you start to work through this path, um, oftentimes I will sit down with an owner and say, and let's just say they weren't in this industry, could you build a custom home for yourself? And I'd venture to say that any owner I know, smart enough entrepreneurs, they can do it. There's no doubt they could do it. But the first one they built would never be as good as the 10th one. And they're only building one, So if you look at it from that standpoint, I would say, well, then let's enlist a top of the line custom home builder. And so that guy would come in and he'd sit down and we'd say to the owner, okay, don't tell him anything, just have him build your custom home. Well, he'd build an amazing custom home, but it would be the home builder's custom home, not the home, not the contract, not the owner's.
Right.
So you have to have that collaboration. And when you have those two things together, the owner can sit there and tap into the resources, the craftsmen, if you will, the suppliers, all the things that has taken years of experience to gain to be able to help them accomplish a better thing than they would have had by themselves. So when you sell a business or transition a business, you're usually doing it once and you don't get a second or third or fourth shot to do it. So you want to make sure you surround yourself with resources that do these things, that have that can help them with the tax ramifications, the long-term estate planning. It's a lot to it, and I know a little bit about a lot, but I have experts in those fields that do, partner with me when needed to be able to get that job done. So it's really a process, and when you do it that way, then you can reach the goals and understand what the goals are. A lot of times the owners don't know until they start to go through the process.
Yeah, I think it's important for that team. Proverbs 15:22 says, "Where there are many advisors, there's much success." And as
Right.
you think about building and scaling a business, and then even transitioning or even acquiring it, sometimes it's important to think about that team of advisors that have real areas of expertise in their particular field. And I know that's hard sometimes for us as business owners to embrace, because we try to be smart and savvy, but great leaders understand the value of having a variety of different team members like you're mentioning. And I think of King David as a great example of that, right? If you look at his court, if you will, the people that were around him, he had some pretty important people that were at his side, and some of them had definitely a warrior spirit, right? That they would go into battle with him, and they were in there defending him and the 70 mighty men that he gathered. But yet, in the time that he needed it most, it was Nathan the priest that came to him and was able to have a spiritual conversation with him.
Exactly.
And so again, it just
Strength
speaks to
finders. That's right. Back to the profiles, right?
that's right. So understanding how valuable it is to have that team around. You mentioned earlier the owner dependence index, and I think that's so valuable. You say it so much nicer than I do, but the reality is that most of business owners are addicted to their business,
Mhm.
right? And I've had to tell more CEOs probably and business owners than any other thing. I had said, hey, you don't own this thing. You're a steward of it. You're addicted, and you're letting this business ruin your life and your marriage and everything else until you can get some control on it. Can you tell us a little bit about how do we know when we're addicted, and why is it so critical for us to not be the business be not so dependent upon us as a business owner or a business leader?
Absolutely. So what I found is in starting even into the exit planning process, one of the first things I'll do with an owner is sit down and walk them through, what are your strengths? What are your abilities? Because a lot of times owners, everybody has them. God's given us those talents. They're all there, but oftentimes they've been pushed aside because as owners, we do whatever it takes to get the job done. And so we'll jump in and do the operational things really more on the sales side. We'll jump in and do maybe some creative stuff when really, that our talents in other places. And so we end up pushing ourselves into areas that maybe aren't our strengths. So it's important to step back and say, what God-given talents do I have? If I'm amazing at going out and building relationships with customers and vendors, then going on a golf course is well spent time that many owners feel guilty about when they shouldn't, because they can pay somebody much less to run the inside office area while they're out there bringing in sales that others can't do. So I think understanding their talents is really important. But probably the most critical thing when we're talking about transition is to understand your next. We really need to know, owners have to get into themselves and say, if my business wasn't here, what would I do next? And when they don't do that, and I can tell you stories of, businesses that, and this is not unusual, one of the groups I'm part of in the exit space, they had a case study, and the study actually was a business that was on the Mid-Atlantic area. The owner came to a merger and acquisition professional and said, I want to sell my business. I want, $50 million for it. And the guy's like, oh, okay, well, that's great. Let's see if that's really worth that. And after they got involved, they realized it really was. There were some intellectual property and other things that were in place, and it really was worth that. So they got to work, and they got in there and they were doing their job. Everything he was asking for, they were doing. They found a buyer. They got all the things in place. All the due diligence is done. Now they sit down at the table to strike the check and sign the papers to settle. And the owner couldn't sign them. And he stepped back and he's like, I don't know where I'm going to go tomorrow. Nobody had asked him that question. And all they would have had to do was had something for him to step into or walked him through something else, and he would have been happy to move on. The deal didn't happen. And all that time and all that effort and everything else, he asked for it, but it's not what he really wanted. And so I think the key is to understand, what will you do next? You can't ignore your talents. You can't ignore the experiences you've built all those years. You want to move that into a new direction, and God would want you to do that. So is it going to be another business? Is it going to be still a part of that business? Perhaps, maybe as a chairman, maybe you're in sales, maybe you're out there golfing every day if you like that. Is it going to be a charity, or is it going to be family? Somewhere you have to put that, or else you won't step away. So that's where the interdependence piece comes in, because when you start to realize that and owners can step away, then they can start doing the planning in a better, more effective way. And there's a survey that you've referred to. It's called the Interdependent Index, part of my certified exit planning group. And we have a number of questions, and I'm happy that anybody's interested, I can send a link to you, Ken, you can send it out. There's a number of questions on it, but basically it does from 0 to 100, how dependent is the business on you as an owner? And then it breaks it down into about 8 different categories, things like the sales side of things, the operations side, the governance. Then we can understand where can we start to work to reduce that. So many owners, to your point, don't realize that's a bad thing. It's like, oh, it's me, it's all me. But the brand, if the brand is all about the owner can't step away from the business easily, or they lose value when they do. So if we can understand that and identify it, then you start to build in the delegation, you start to build in the team that steps up behind you. That's where you build a business with a legacy that most owners truly want, but they've never done that because it's always been wrapped around their dependents.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I liked your statement of building value, not just profitability. And of course, we believe in profitability, but when we think about it in terms of value, what am I doing to bring the most value to this business? And sometimes that means, we talk about at CXP, the importance of followership, right? Sometimes it means stepping back so others can step forward. Making sure that the business is, I like to say it this way, I say the business should operate better with me in it, but should operate well without me in it. And
absolutely.
Right.
And the key ends up being too, many times when I'm sitting down with an owner, it's the first time they've ever thought about getting out of their business. They've never, we're not talking about the serial entrepreneurs that buy and sell. They tend to treat the business as an investment, as it should be treated. Most owners treat it as a job, or as a part of them, and they can't separate themselves. So when they do get ready to transition out, it's usually some life triggering event that's pushed that. Now we have this crisis and COVID and everything going on. That's pushing a lot of people. I'm getting a lot of inquiries now from people that I've dealt with, clients in the past, who are like, okay, I'm done. I'm ready to get out, but I don't want to just give it away. Help me get through it in the right process. But there's life triggering events. Before this all happened, it was usually a friend or a colleague or a family member, somebody got sick, all these things were going on. And they said, oh my gosh, I got to do something different, because this isn't a very important thing, but it's not the urgent thing that's screaming at you until that trigger goes off. And now we start to move into process. And same thing with making sure you have the right insurances in place and making sure your estate planning is proper, up to date. These are things that nobody would say they shouldn't do, but most people kick the can down the road because, it's going to be me later. And so I think when you talk about building value in the business, as you mentioned, value in the business comes from how a buyer would see the business. And so helping an owner understand what's important to a buyer. And very oftentimes, not every single business, but most businesses are sold on a multiple of profitability, or a thing we call EBITDA. So it's a profitability net income calculator. So if you think about it that way, by doing things more effectively, efficiently, building operational systems in place and foundations that the business can run without you, well, now you can step away, it still runs, you've just increased your value, so the multiple will be higher. Better systems and processes make it easier for a buyer to come in and take over, but it also prevents you from being discounted. Because in every business deal, there's usually either a premium or a discount. So I kind of say it's kind of like when you sell a house. Somebody's painting that wall. If you're selling it and you paint it, you get a premium. If you sell it and the buyer paints it, they take a discount. So we want to think about it in those terms. And as we build those things towards value, that profitability, by adding $100 of profit times a multiple, let's just say it's 3 or 5 times that, that's exponential growth in value by doing certain things that are more attractive to a buyer.
Mhm. I think that's fantastic, Stu. Man, great advice. I was, when you were talking about premium versus a discount, I was thinking of probably my relationship. I got the premium, my wife got the discount, right? but you're right. I mean, every transaction has that to some degree. Either it's going
That's what makes us good salesmen, Ken, right?
Yeah, we had a question about the COVID-19. You mentioned, you've been getting a lot of calls and people saying, hey, I'm done. Are you seeing a major mind shift from business owners because of the COVID-19 virus?
I think what's happening, and it's generally the same in not just in business, but in life. It's kind of, as pressures applied, as challenges and crises come to the forefront, you become kind of more of who you are. And so if you're a very, nervous and anxious person, that just gets expanded on. If you're someone who digs in and tries to find solutions, that gets expanded on. So wherever you are, it's exposing those challenges and weaknesses. And truthfully, I think a lot of times, so you can, if you're willing, God can work on those for you. So and I know through the history of my life, there's been a lot of challenges coming along that have made me stronger to be able to do things better down the road that I didn't really want to go through. But because I went through them and I recognized them for that, then when an opportunity came along, or I could share that with somebody or help somebody else, then that made it worth having gone through. I mean, there's value that I could see from that. So with COVID, I think what's happening is owners who already were thinking about getting out are now kind of moving that time frame forward. They're kind of at that point where I'm not having them come and saying fire sale me and I want to just get pennies on a dollar. Nobody wants that. But I have had some come back to me and say, we talked about a couple years out. I don't think I want to wait that long. Let's look at a 6 to 12-month plan. And I know I'm going to take a discount on that, but I'm ready to do another thing in life. And so they're looking at it that way. Now that it produces opportunity for a buyer. And I have clients in that space too, who are finding people who are saying, I was looking to retire, but now I'm really ready to get out. And how can we do that? So to me, I try to equalize risk. And I say that in a way that, buyers don't want to spend much money and sellers don't want to take less than they think it's worth. And they want it all up front. And somewhere in between is the happy medium, because it's very rare that you have a small business owner who just has somebody come in and say, here's all the cash you ever wanted. You're done, you're out, you don't have to be involved anymore, and we'll take all the risk. That, not that it never happens, but it's rare. And so most of the time it's coming to an agreement where there's a fair exchange, and maybe it's more time involved. Maybe it's paid on sales in the future, because now we don't have the same history and we don't know where things are going to go for the next so many months. Some companies are doing better, and so they'll be worth more, and they've kind of shed the excess weight. They've had to cut back, they've had to be trimmed, they've had to really take a hard look at their business, and they're going to come out of this very strong and ready to move forward. Other businesses, not so much.
Right. Yeah, you've talked about that there's different types of businesses all the time, but I think in times of crisis, you're really going to see those businesses that may give up or give in versus those that are really going to do some acquisition or growth even during this phase. And I do want to have that conversation, but let me go back, because I think it's important as we think about this model that you talk about, exit, growth, transition. One of the things that I love about what you do is that you help a lot of business owners build their own buyer, if you will, by looking internally at their staff or their team. And, one of the biblical business principles that I teach is build to the fourth generation. That, a lot of times, unfortunately, in small businesses, not only in America, but all over the world, businesses die with the business owner. And if they can make it through this first 5 years, crisis is happening in China besides the COVID right now, because a lot of family-owned businesses don't have a second generation to hand it to, nor are they prepared to hand it. And so something like 80% of the businesses in China are, they don't have a second generation owner. So there's not always a family member that you can turn to, but you've discovered a pretty unique technique where you can look into a potential your own team and begin to, over a period of time, help them to scale up to ownership. Can you talk about that concept of, I like it, that terminology you use, I believe, build your buyer?
Correct. Yes, absolutely, Ken. So I kind of came across this as I was looking through the exit planning process. And the reason it's exit, growth, transition is the first step we have to take really is an exit plan. We have to figure out, what does the owner need? What are their personal needs? Usually if they don't have a wealth manager, we need to connect them with one. But we want to figure out, what's the value gap between what they personally have and what the business is worth. Because at the end of the day, if there's a value gap, they have to either reduce what they personally need, or they have to increase the value of the business. So, many times owners will say, how much is your business worth? And they'll say whatever they want it to be, or whatever they need it to be. And that's not always realistic. So this gives them kind of a game plan of, what do we need to do to get there? And then from there, as you mentioned, there's multiple exit options, one of which is an internal transfer. And the internal transfer, the benefits there, a lot of times people will call them management buyouts. There's different ways to do that. But the benefit is, you have a team that's been working with you, that understands the culture, that hopefully embraces the culture and wants to continue that. But you're not stepping into a change where somebody from the outside is coming in to bring in their own team, their own culture. Customers are, kind of tossed upside down a little bit. The vendors, everybody kind of has to go through this integration transition process. And it's challenging, painful, and sometimes it doesn't work. And so by looking at it and identifying within your team who has the skills, back to the profiles again, who has the strengths, who has an ownership mentality versus an employee mentality. And I truly believe, people have one or the other. It's not something, that's not a skill. That's not something that's trained. That's something that maybe because you grew up in a family that were entrepreneurs, that was built into your DNA. And so if someone doesn't have it, it's very difficult for them to gain it, and they will look at it from the standpoint of, and when we were going out, you would see the same difference. You'd see somebody, you walk into a place and you'd be at the end of the day and you wanted to, get some food or whatever, and you basically were annoying the people who were working there because you showed up late. Now, if the owner's working there, they're like, hey, stay longer. It's okay. What can I do for you?
Right.
There's a different mentality in owners and employees. And so the owner has a task to be able to either identify someone within his team or hire somebody and bring them into his team that has that owner mentality. And then you groom them. It takes time. I mean, this isn't an overnight thing typically. This is a couple-year process where you're grooming them, teaching them, improving the systems and processes, and then you can create a transition plan to move to that employee. And I worked with a company a year ago, and we did just that. The owner was actually brought me in to help him sell his business. And he was just, I'm done, I'm ready to get out. And the more we talked, the more I realized how important that was, because he started so many years ago. It was so important to him. And we started going through, and he was talking about his team and how much he cared about his people and his customers. And the more we talked, I was like, yeah, that's not going to be in place if you sell to this large company out there that's a potential buyer. And he said, you're right. And I said, who's in your team that's like you, that maybe 20 years ago, that you could kind of bring up and groom and move into that role? And we identified a guy, and it's just like, oh yeah, this guy, he and his wife are just like me and my wife when we started. And that's kind of like, to me, it was like, that was very obvious to me, but it wasn't obvious to him at first. But he's like, he wouldn't be interested. Have you ever asked him? When he asked him, he said, yeah, I am interested. So we went through the whole process where they were shifting that ownership to the employee and his wife. And that would have come up if you just went out and just sold it. And the whole business legacy would not have been maintained.
And then they can, the employee that ends up purchasing, they can have a longer payout to the business owner, because they can buy it out of the proceeds of the new revenue that's generated out of the business. That's one possible way, right?
Absolutely. And typically, what people don't always realize as owners who are selling a company, most buyers don't come in, like I said, and give you all the money up front. They give you a percentage, maybe 25%, maybe 50%, and then they give the rest to you in an earnout. The earnout is based on future sales. Well, if the sales drop off because you were the salesman for the thing and you're not there anymore, or something else goes on, you're not going to get the extra money you were hoping to get for your business. When you have someone inside, they're continuing to run the business you've been running, and you already have systems, processes, and things in place, you're going to see a more likely continuation of that business because it's not all new to them. And you can get a payout, which oftentimes can go longer and be larger because the business is continuing to grow as they are taking it over. So, from a lot of different perspectives, it makes a lot of sense. So, yep.
Good. Hey, we're going to have a couple minutes. I know I'm already getting to some questions as well, but I did want to turn our attention to, I love obviously thinking about how do we transition to keep the business growing, but also I think at this moment, there's real power in thinking about acquisition. We just have seen a few companies, larger companies, declare bankruptcy, and we know that there might even be some smaller businesses that have difficulty navigating this COVID crisis. One of the things that you do well, and I think every small business, every business should think about it, is help potentially thinking about acquiring either another business or parts of a business in order to expand and grow. Can you talk a little bit about the value of, even from a small privately owned mom pop kind of small business mindset, of thinking in terms of acquisition?
Absolutely. So what I've kind of also coined a little bit, we talk about build your next buyer, but also I look at buy your next buyer. And from the same kind of mentality of, we're looking for someone, and I've had this conversation with a number of owners. Let's say that if you could find someone like yourself 20 years earlier, how could we take that person? What would you feel if somebody came to you 20 years ago and said, look, you don't have to start from scratch, or you've just started your business and I know you're struggling. I know you know what to do, but why don't you come along with me and I'll buy your business with a promise to be able to give you option to buy me back out. And let's spend some time together as you're growing the business. And then you've got you've got somebody that's already run a business who has that potential to grow. and take on that next legacy, that next generation.
Mm.
So that's one kind of direction to kind of look at, is look for people who are in businesses like yours that are smaller than, that you can, the biggest thing is core values. They have to be aligned. You can't find other business owners who don't treat their customers the way you want to treat them, or their employees, and expect that to ever work. So the core values have to be aligned. But if you find other owners like that, you can create agreements to be able to take over and move to the next level and build your business to the next size. What I'm seeing, and before this all started, you were doing some of this, now it's even probably going to be more so, because there are a lot of owners who are ready to step away and don't know how to do it. And so they're, I'm working with a client right now, we're doing just that, where there were two guys who were looking to retire, and they're just like, I like the way you guys run your business. You do it the way we run it. We want to be able to have some kind of an agreement. What can we do? Because otherwise that seller would just shut down, and then the customers won't be served. The employees that they have, will be unemployed. So there's really a great kind of legacy that's continued by being able to find the good talent, to be able to serve those other customers. And these are the kind of deals that are being put together that really aren't going to be a lot of cash out the door, but anything that comes from the future business will be, there'll be a sharing of that in some fashion. So finding those companies that are ready to step away, and they, it's to me, I always kind of joke about it, but it's kind of like, like say you had a classic car for all these years and you just took meticulous care of it and you loved it and you took care of it. It was amazing. And now you're at a stage in life where it's just too much work, too much effort. You just can't do it anymore. You don't want to, if two people came down the road and wanted to buy it, and one was a 23-year-old who had, all kinds of money from his family and wanted that kind of car, but you knew he was going to run it to the ground, wasn't going to take care of it, but you'd make more money on it. Or you have another guy that's a few years younger than you, who's been looking for this all his life, found it, wants to take it to the next level, wants to love it and care for it like you did. It wouldn't be a hard decision.
Right. Hey, Stu, one of the questions that we got, I agree with you. And I just was putting in there about finding people with that stewardship mentality, same values, same attitude, that owner mentality that you talked about. And boy, that's so critical. I think you even need to look at that in hiring, potentially, as you bring people on. Do I think they have an owner mentality or an employee mentality? And again, it's okay. Different people have different perspectives and different attitudes, but we just want to make sure that we're focused on the business and from a stewardship perspective. And that may be somebody that is a potential owner of the business. Jesus really followed that model in some ways. He built his disciples over a 3-year period so that they were ready to lead when he left. But one of the questions that we got was, what do you see as the biggest financial mistake that most small businesses make?
That's a great question. I don't know if I'd say the biggest. I said there's a handful of ones that probably kind of come in together. I'd say one of the challenges that does take place is matching debt with growth. I say that in a sense of, I've watched companies really struggle when they've gone through and they're successful and they don't, maybe extend their line of credit to, what they're available, not to use it, but to have it available, because when they don't always understand that a bank doesn't want to give money when you need it. The bank wants to give money when there's no risk. And so they will, end up getting, I had a client years back who was a government contractor, and I just kept pushing him like, you're doing really well. Get a line of credit, set it up, let's have that in place. You don't have to have it. It's a rainy day thing. And he didn't do that. And then sequestration came in. And all of a sudden, through no fault of his own, he lost his, contracts. Or they wanted him to do it without being paid. Right. The line of credit would help him keep going. He didn't have it and the bank wouldn't touch it. So, now, it's tougher to get certain things, traditionally. So I think, and even if a company is like investing in the future in either research and development or other things that they're building their business with, that should be funded from long-term debt. Because when they don't do that, if they take, and just do all this money into research and development because they're profitable, and then things change, they've mismatched their debt, so from that standpoint. But the other thing I think is probably the biggest financial mistake, I would say as a company grows, it's very important for them to surround themselves with advisors that will take them to the next level. There's a lot of times companies get stalled at 1 million, 5 million, 10 million caps because they have started with a group of advisors that were good for the beginning, but they weren't ahead of them. They weren't pulling them along. So, they weren't helping them be strategic. They were just responding to, current needs. And so it's great to have a tax return completed. That's fantastic. But if you're not strategically looking at the next 2 to 5 years and building your business through a vision, then how do you know how to build value and where to put the time and energy and how to separate yourself back out of it?
We got a couple quick questions. I'd love to hit them because they're so critical. They said, what financial reports should business owners be paying attention to and or financial numbers?
Sure. You should really have a dashboard. The dashboard should be, and nowadays, I mean, we need to look very closely at cash flow. Cash is king. What ends up happening a lot of times, owners will look at the revenue and profitability of their business, the P&L statement, profit and loss statement, and that's great. It's important, but that's a month ago or more. That's not forward looking. So that gives them some idea of what's been happening, but not necessarily where things are going. So if you start looking towards more forecasts and cash flow, you can have cash that's being affected by non-profit and loss items, not expense items. Things like if you're paying for vehicles, if you're paying for loans, if you're paying for, things that are on the balance sheet, that affects cash, but it's not showing up in a profit and loss. So I think nowadays having a rolling 13-week cash flow statement forecast is really critical, because we have to look at that weekly almost for a lot of companies. Before, you could probably get by with looking at it less often. But with changes and pivoting and making decisions, it's very important to look at those things very quickly. Obviously, receivables, that's the lifeblood. That's money that's not in yet. So, and in this day and age right now, there's a lot of businesses who are having hard times keeping up with their payments. You want to be the one that's collecting that. You want to be the one that's getting the money in on your receivables, and the squeaky wheel does get the grease. So, if you just ignore it, then people will ignore it as well. So you have to set a precedent with your clients that you expect those payments.
Excellent. And then this was a good question. How do you know if you have a good bookkeeper, or what should a company look for when hiring a head of finance or a head of the financial department for their company?
It's a great question. Well, first off, timely reporting. There's no reason this day and age that you shouldn't have by 10th or 15th of the month the financial statements, balance sheet, and profit and loss and receivables from the past month. So being able to get those things done quickly and closed out. There unfortunately is a very vast difference in bookkeepers out there. Some understand payroll, some do not. So being able to find out what their history has been, good references on that. I think also there needs to be, I feel like, some oversight. I think ultimately in a lower mid-market company, it's good to have that on-site bookkeeper slash accountant that's doing that heavy lifting day to day, and then somebody that's on the outside looking in. Maybe it's an outsourced CFO or somebody that's spending some small amount of time on strategically, because that person that's inside all the time can't see the forest for the trees a lot of times. That's not their role. So being able to have some oversights for checks and balances is pretty important. You want to be able to know that controls are in place. So that bookkeeper is not the same one who's getting the reconciliation, signing the checks, making all payments. They have complete control. That's where you have challenges with fraud and embezzlement that show up.
Excellent. Boy, great comments. And, and I'm sure Stu and I could talk about, unfortunately for a number of companies and a number of even small businesses, because they have somebody that they trust or somebody that they just expect to do the job, and they release some of that financial controls, oftentimes a fraud can happen, money can be taken or misplaced or managed poorly. And I've just seen it so many times in especially small businesses, just because most small business owners have a passion for what they do. They're not necessarily always driven by the finance of it, but it is important.
Well, and that's to the point of having, not just having those financials done each month, but having a meeting with your financial team each month
Mm.
and ask the questions, where is this, where's that? Because sometimes they misplace things. And, so you want to let them know that you are watching. But typically, again, I think if a company wants to get to the next level, they need to bring in the resources that have done work with companies at that next level.
Mm.
So, that's an important piece, is to help them move to the next stage.
Yeah, we had a recommendation or thought. Tracy said that using some dual signatures for larger expenses is a
Mhm.
smart strategy as well, and I totally agree with that.
Right. Well, and the challenge you have now is so much is being done electronically
Mhm.
that we have to be able to, have the checks and balances in to know that that's being controlled as well.
Mhm.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, one of the questions that we got that I thought was real important, it said during this remote time, how do you control some of the financial accounting and to make sure that it doesn't get corrupt or lost with people being dispersed? Any comments or thoughts on?
most of the CPA firms that I deal with now have been pushing towards online versions of accounting. QuickBooks Online is one of the biggest ones right now. They've moved things in a direction to make it more and more secure, but also easier for the outside CPAs and accountants to be connected in and be able to monitor, or have the external CFOs be able to monitor. So I think that's one of the big things to kind of do. If you have things that are all remote, you can track that. Back to reporting again, you still want to see the reports as an owner. You still want to have access to the bank statements and control of that, so that you know what's going on with those. You can pull them at any time. It's when you lose that control and access that you have more of a challenge. But really, you can run just about any business remote these days, with electronic payments, with electronic invoices, and it's actually more efficient. So we just have to keep our thumb on it to, have somebody on your team, on your executive team, who's watching that, even if it's a outsourced resource.
So you've been talking a lot about value and adding value from an organizational standpoint, developing good financial controls, developing robust processes,
Mhm.
thinking about the longer term strategy of where do you want to go and how dependent am I on it. Um, one of the areas that you focus on is what you call growth from an organization, and driving profitability related to that. One of the questions that we received that I thought was really important is how do you determine the right size of growth? How quick do you grow? And do you have any good comments on determining the best way to grow? Like, is it really focused on sales, or is it focused on internal processes? I know that's big question, but we're wrapping up here, so
Right.
you
Uh,
take it wherever you'd like to go.
so when I look at growth, and as I kind of mentioned, I spent 10 years working with many different companies as an outsourced CFO, as part of a national firm. And so I got the benefit of a lot of other CFO advisors that I could tap into, and resources and whatnot. And really what I think it comes down to is we have to determine, let's begin with the end in mind. What growth do we need to achieve the owner's goals? I have owners that say to me, I need to have X dollars out of my business net after I've sold it to be able to achieve my personal goals. Okay, that's one thing. I have others that said, I'm already there, but I'm not done yet. And I want to be able to make that impactful for my team. So I want my team to be able to, executive team or my whole team, to be able to benefit from any transition down the road. And all the help they've helped me to get to this point, I want to reward them for that. So I need to get to a higher level. So first is determine what your goals are, and then you create a vision around that. And the vision will drive it. So some people, at 5 million might be super happy because they're very profitable, and it's, they're not having to set up multiple branches and have as many employees, and that's just great. There's other people that want to be 20, 30, $50 million. And it's all personal preference based on the owner. So we have to start there. But once we've decided where we're trying to go, then it's a multiple of processes. It's not just sales, because if your sales go up and your margins go down, you're working harder for less.
Mm.
So it's really about what is the bottom line, what's our net profit coming out of that. I like to watch gross profit, because I feel gross profit is something that cannot be really, you know, affected or messed with, if you will, by anybody involved. And I say it in the sense of owners have every right to adjust their net profit based on their tax planning, based on their goals, based on the fact that they worked so hard for years and now they, are trying to catch up on things. They can do that. They can reinvest. That's net profit. But gross profit, your sale minus your cost for the sale, giving you a gross profit, that is what it is. And that's really where we do pay for performance plans from. That's where we bring the employees into, just to be part of that, because they can help control that. They can reduce costs, they can increase sales to increase that gross profit. And the gross profit will drive the future. So that's where I think we need to focus.
Well, that's a powerful statement. If your sales go up, but your margins go down, you're just working harder for the same or less. And boy, that's powerful to think about. Again, that margin that you're creating. It's not just growing sales, but it really is about growing margins. So, hey, Stu, this.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, if you can build those operational systems in place that don't, require, I mean, you see so many times small businesses, everything's kind of band-aided and patched together and only people in there know it. And if they get sick or hurt or leave, then they're really struggling. You want systems and processes that are documented very well, standard operating procedures in place so that other people can come in, but it also allows those people to grow to the next level.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think just having those processes are really critical. And I think we didn't get a chance to talk in depth about this, but, when businesses come in, part of the reason the franchises are so successful is because they have thought through processes. Right. And anybody can step into that and say, oh, I can run that. Well, for many small businesses that don't necessarily want to work under a franchise structure, that's appropriate. That's completely, maybe they're called to create their own brand. But the difficulty comes because they often don't develop those processes. They have them sometimes, but they've never really implemented them or executed them. And so if somebody else would come in, it would be hard for them to continue to function the business at that level because they've never thought through those processes, right? So processes can drive, I like how you're putting that, processes can drive margins, because if we can do things better, faster, quicker, there's not a redundancy on it. There's not a remake or having to redo things 15 different times, or even to stop to make the decision of how this is done, right? It all costs. That's cost money. So,
and value. It drives value too.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Stu, this has been a great conversation, super engaging and so important and helpful to us as business owners and CEOs. You can find out more about Stu and the Owner Dependence Index, and he has a special download of an encouragement paper on his website about 5 attitudes that you should have as you come through the COVID perspective right at the moment. If you go to egtadvisors.com, egtadvisors with an S.com, you can find Stu's website and contact him to get some more information. I highly recommend it. I think Stu has got a great business mind. He's lived it. He's experienced it from both the family business, from his own personal business experiences as he's running and grown his own business, and then also in the businesses that he's really worked for. Hey guys, I hope that this has been extremely helpful to you today. I think it's been extremely insightful as we've talked about business acquisitions, business growth, business development, the Owner Independence Index, thinking through how we navigate, how tied to the business we are, and even dealing with some family business issues. All these things are critical for us to understand as we build our businesses to the 4th generation. So, hey, Stu, thanks for the great insight, and thanks for being such a great guest.
I appreciate it, Ken. Thanks for having me.
All right. We will be having another CEO conversation, so stay tuned to our emails or continue to watch the YouTube channel for the next CEO conversation, and we do welcome you back into that conversation as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day now. Talk to you soon.